Cohen, are you introducing?
I will.
Perfect. Perfect.
Yes. So, hi, hello. I see, Catherine. I see you're there. Feel free to, stay off camera, but great to see you. Today we are having our monthly huddle, and the person leading our huddle today is Dan Zimet. I will let Dan introduce himself in a minute, but today's topic is athlete burnout. It's something that a lot of us athletes have dealt with, and so Dan is an expert, I would say, in this field, and so really excited to hear, what he has to share with us on the topic today. Dan, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself. You've been a wonderful contributor to Athlete Soul for a while now, and so would just love to hear a little bit more about your background so everyone else knows more about you.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate that. So I'm Daniel Zimet. I'm a licensed psychologist. I'm also a certified mental performance consultant or sports psychologist. I've been in private practice for over 20 years. I'm also a senior athlete. I have 41 national titles in handball. And I do a lot of work with athletes and teams. What got me involved with Athlete Soul in the first place was my research and work on athlete transition out of competition. And I'm a published researcher in that area, and very interested in supporting athletes on their journey to excel both in sport and then in the rest of their lives once they leave sport. And this subject of burnout is an important one, both in terms of thinking about transition out of sport, since burnout or loss of motivation is not an uncommon contributor to people thinking about leaving sport. But it's also a very painful thing to deal with when you are in sport and either needing to continue for whatever reason, or feel trapped into continuing. It's a very difficult experience, burnout really as a whole, but in sport in particular.
Yes. And can you share with us, Dan, a little bit about, I mean, some of us know kind of the experience having been through it, but can you just kind of go over what some of the kind of typical symptoms are of burnout, just in case
Yeah,
it's not clear?
absolutely. So, burnout is one of those things, in some ways it's a little bit like love. It can be a little bit hard to define, but you certainly know when you're experiencing it. The research on burnout is probably now 50 or so years old. So it started in about the 80s. Um, Burnout is generally thought of as having three prominent features. The one that most of us are accustomed to talking about is exhaustion. It's this feeling of physical and emotional, all the way down to your deep burning core of just being so tired. And for athletes, I think this is particularly hard, both because sport requires so much of us physically and emotionally, but also because athletes are used to going into that reservoir of finding that next gear, that extra little burst, pushing through. And when someone is experiencing burnout, they go into that place and they come up empty. The bucket goes into the well and no water comes back out. So that's really, I think, one of the most prominent features. The other two aspects are a reduced sense of accomplishment. So looking at what you're doing, what you've done, how things are going, and just not really feeling that sense of value, that sense of esteem, that feeling of accomplishment, that you're improving or that you're making a difference, or that you really maybe even want the things that come from your sport achievement, which speaks to the third aspect, which is this kind of devaluation of the entire sport experience. For some, that might look like cynicism. For some, that can look like just not caring anymore. Just that hunger, that want, that love, or even arguably lust for your sport achievement just feels like it's evaporated. And so often athletes who are burned out are really asking themselves, like, why am I doing this? Um, and the answer to that came as self-evident for their entire career. But now they're asking that question and they just don't feel like they have an answer that speaks from their heart. And so those three factors, exhaustion, loss of a feeling of accomplishment, and sort of the devaluation of their sport engagement. Anytime you're doing research or really in many ways talking about burnout, those are the three things that are most prominent.
I love what you said about equating it to love, that it's kind of something that you can't describe, but maybe once you get on the other side of it, you can look back and say, oh, that's what that was, right? But maybe when you're in it, you don't know exactly how to define it.
Yeah, though burnout has an advantage of, I think, being very well named. I think that just the term itself resonates with a person when they hear it. Um, and I think that what it speaks to is if you liken your sport engagement to something vital and growing and developing, like almost like a garden or something that is really flourishing, burnout speaks to the fact that all of that feels like scorched earth, like you're taking a flame to ash and there's just nothing left to burn. And so it has that resonance to it that I think is very instinctively um, intuitive of burnout. That just sounds like what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you say kind of in your experience? I know that it's possible for obviously this to be a cycle, right? That athletes could go through and kind of come out of on the other side. What's some of your experience about seeing athletes through that kind of cycle through burnout and go back to being, motivated and maybe at the top of their sport?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different circumstances that can speak to whether or not that is likely to occur. Um, Certain kind of environmental conditions lend themselves to an increased likelihood of burnout. Certain traits or characteristics that the athlete brings to their sport can also contribute to that. You're much more likely to experience burnout if um, you have certain mental health conditions that you're struggling with, um, or if the results that you're experiencing aren't meeting what your goals are or what you feel like you should be attaining. If that comes to pass, just the rewards are not matching the investment that you're putting in. Um, and so, there's a host of different conditions that can lead to it. When that's prolonged and a person really sinks deeply into burnout, boy, it can just be very hard to find your way out of it. It can take something pretty dramatic and time to really heal from it. Many people just decide, okay, it's not really worth the effort. Because when you start to feel like you've lost your love of sport, unless there are other rewards that you can't turn away from, why else are you doing it? At the end of the day, sport is play with rules and you play for fun. So if it's not fun, what are you doing? Um, if you're in a career where as an elite athlete, there's other things that are depending on you, that also can contribute to burnout. There's a sense of feeling trapped and unable to escape the circumstance you're in, not having another alternative. Uh, that in itself is a very precarious position that's even worse because then people feel compelled to continue, but are really not in any way enjoying what they're doing. That is a very difficult circumstance, and probably one of the hardest transitions out of sport for athletes is going through a prolonged period of burnout leading to retirement. It's not as though you just retire and then you feel wonderful. You do feel a sense of relief, but it takes a long time to come back from these types of emotions. They don't just instantly go away.
Mhm. Yeah. You mentioned some specific traits. Can you share a little bit more about what those traits might be in athletes that are more prone to burnout, maybe?
Yeah, so, we can look at them from two different directions. The single best treatment for burnout is not to get burned out in the first place. Um, this is one of those things where once you are in it, uh, it's very tough to get out of it. It's like injury prevention. What's the best way to overcome an injury? Don't get hurt in the first place. And so, some of those protective variables are being in a supportive sport environment where you feel like you have autonomy, you can really relate to the people who are there, you feel a sense of competence that you're growing, developing, learning, building. Your path within sport is rewarding. If you're grateful for that, you feel a sense of appreciation. If you have good mental tools, so there's a certain resilience, there's a certain mental toughness, there's a certain utilization of constructive mental skills within your sport. That's always helpful. Um, and then the autonomy piece. You feel like a part of it is you're doing it for you. You're doing it because you want to. You're doing it because you love what you're doing. You feel like you're making a choice. This is a voluntary experience. You could step out if you felt like you needed to. Um, those are all the protective factors, or many of the protect. I'm sure I'm forgetting a few, so apologies to any that I'm forgetting, but that's generally a lot of the um, personal protective factors. Um, when you have a team that you care about, they care about you. It's a non-punitive environment. Um, you feel like you're loved for being more than just someone who produces well in your sport. Um, uh, and you are able to make mistakes, have bad days, um, have periods where your motivation is a little bit dipped and you get um, support for that rather than criticism or shame. Those things also matter. And, I like to think that it also helps to have an off season and also to have an identity that is not so entirely wrapped into your sport that that's the only thing that affects your self-esteem. Nothing goes well all of the time. The best marriage has difficult times. The best job has things that you don't feel like doing. And so being able to diversify where your energy is off season wise, but also in season of having other things that also fulfill you, that is also helpful.
Mhm. Yeah. I imagine that there's also kind of a connection between burnout and perfectionism, right? So for athletes who have those perfectionistic tendencies, I imagine their propensity for getting burned out is pretty high. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but
Mhm.
all athletes are in some way or another obsessive perfectionists if they are really at the elite level or wanting to get to the elite level. However, the way that they exhibit that perfectionism is we call this a personal standards striving towards perfectionism. And this is having goals for perfection that you are building towards and that you really genuinely care about on an intrinsic level. And so this is someone, this is a golfer spending 3 hours a day for 2 straight weeks in the sand trap because they want to be perfect in their sand recovery. And they see that goal improving. And even though your sort of average person would be like, okay, this is compulsive behavior, they want to do it. This is a personal striving for perfectionism. That is actually, believe it or not, a little bit of a shielding from burnout, that type of engagement. We call this harmonious passion. You are engaged in your passion in a way that is in harmony with you. Now you contrast that with the more toxic form of perfectionism, which is really more about, we call this evaluative concerns perfectionism. You're worried with fear. So you're riddled with fear about making mistakes, losing, getting negative evaluations, failing in being able to do something. And so this kind of perfectionism is much more about fear of not being perfect as opposed to striving for perfection. And so those are very different aspects. And the evaluative one, fear of mistakes not being perfect, is very much predictive of burnout. The other one actually operates as a little bit of a protective mechanism.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. And what about kind of any differences between athletes involved in individual versus team sports as it relates to burnout?
Yeah, so interestingly, team athletes are more vulnerable than individual athletes. Um, Individual athletes generally feel a little bit more autonomy, and they also don't have to experience the pressure of letting their team or teammates down. And so when a person feels burned out, generally there's a withdrawal from being able to fully invest their entire self into their sport. And so their performance tends to drop. They're not training as hard. It's hard for them to care quite as much. They're just not as invested and they're not happy. All of that plays out in the locker room and on the field. And there's a lot of feelings of shame and guilt over letting your team down by not performing as well as you know that you can or feel like you should be, but feeling compelled that you have to. Whereas in an individual sport, yeah, really you're just letting yourself down. And so you don't have that added burden.
Yeah. In terms of just research that have you done any specific research on burnout that?
So indirectly. So
Okay.
burnout is one of the reasons why athletes state that they have retired from sport. They lost their love of the game, and that's their primary reason. And in studying, I've done some study on those individuals. And what we find is that they're one of the most at-risk groups while they are still competing, because they're very likely to be feeling miserable all the time and just are in a very, very negative space, but may feel like they're trapped, which is a predictor of escalating burnout, is feeling like you have no choice. And so if you have that stuck feeling and you are burned out, the period leading up to your retirement can be pretty awful. I would argue they're one of the more at-risk groups prior to their retirement. The day of their retirement comes as a relief. That is the single most prominent observation of someone who is experiencing burnout. If you ask them, well, what was it like the day that you finally hung up the cleats and walked away? And that is what they'll tell you. Oh, it was a relief. Now, does that cure the burnout? Not entirely. It's still a long road. It lingers over you, because you're just so drained. You think about sort of that scorched earth feeling, and it takes a while for something to sprout in that, because there's just no nutrients left.
Right. Right. And what have you seen, what has been your experience in terms of supporting athletes kind of on the other side? So if they're burnt out, they retire, in this burnt out state, what are kind of the next steps towards, exploring what's next when you're kind of working at a deficit in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. And I liken it to, what is the first thing that you do for someone who's experienced prolonged hunger and starvation? You don't just, take them to the all you can eat buffet and shove food down their face. You have to slowly refuel yourself. And that takes time, being around people who care about you, who you care about, nurturing yourself with the basics, getting proper rest, eating properly, getting some healthy physical activity, um, thinking about your hobbies and interests that are of interest to you, that you might be willing to put some time in, and reacquainting yourself with, well, what is life for me when I don't have this hanging over my head, and learning to be patient with that process, knowing that you don't have to be super happy, super gung ho, you know, back in it full force right away, and being aware that that will come back over time. So recognizing the fact that this is not a permanent state of being, but it's a slow recovery, I think is often helpful. I think that athletes feel like there's a quick fix and then I'll be back into it, and I just need to um, bootstrap myself and just find that other gear. And I think that there's some education about what to expect as you go through this process, and knowing you're not alone. Many people have gone through this as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's always it's one of the difficulties, right, of transitioning away from sport, right? Just this huge kind of emotional piece that's carried with you, and even if you leave it on a good note, right? There's still this huge undercurrent of emotion that comes with you into the next phase of life.
Yeah,
And
there's so many things that you have to deal with simultaneously.
right, right. But also too, as you shift and go into the working world or whatever's next for you, burnout can appear there as well. And so can you talk about kind of some of the differences as, athletes kind of transition into, civilian life, I'll call it,
Yeah.
and how burnout shows up there, and maybe, is it the same things that they could do to kind of avoid it in their professional lives as they would have done in sports?
I think there are many similarities. Um, and I think it really comes down to recognizing risk factors, and also being able to self-evaluate and be able to see within oneself um, what you are experiencing. And why athletes, I think, are particularly vulnerable is they have such a just gut it out mentality that they may not be able to adequately recognize how hurt they really are. And they may devalue all of the things that you need to do to either get yourself back on track or to um, be able to, what's the right term for it? Not cope, um, not harden yourself, have resilience. And that's engaging in a lot of self-care. And athletes are not necessarily good at that. Um, they're used to being able to always buckle down and barrel through. Um, and that can just lead things to progress too far.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, And so what would you say, Dan, kind of are some other elements that you think are important, would be important for athletes to know who are approaching the end of their, athletic career, that you haven't shared yet about as it relates to burnout?
As it relates to burnout. I mean, know that it'll get better.
Mhm.
Know that there are resources out there, Athlete Soul being one of them, people like myself being another. Know that you're not alone. I mean, this is such a very common experience, and that it's pretty miserable, but it's also not, doesn't have to be permanent. Um, Being open to change, having forward thinking, um, being honest with yourself about the situation that you're in. And sometimes you have to make really hard choices. Um, Relationships with long-term coaches that have turned negative, but having never really necessarily had a different coach, or being afraid of making that change, of entering the transfer portal, or of just going to a different gym, working with someone else. Having those honest conversations with coaches is really hard. Um, Being assertive with both yourself and the way you engage your sport is important. That's a part of, I think, being honest, being able to say, I need time off. I can't do that additional, whatever it is, that additional tournament, that additional media appearance, being able to take breaks. This is part of why so many professional tennis players are advocating for changes to the season. Everybody is going to want more of you. And at some time or other, you have to stand up for yourself to be able to recognize that you can only compete well if you compete healthy. And that's just not about your body and the need for rest. It's also about your mind and the need for rest. The best example I have for this is when you're training for a marathon, which is a little bit like what a sports season is. But when you're training for a marathon, you peak your training 10 to 14 days before the actual marathon. You need to give your body an opportunity to rest before you put it through that. Rest is an integral part of peak performance. A lot of athletes feel like there's no such thing as too much training. And that's just really not the case, mentally and physically. So being able to be honest with yourself about what you can handle and still be at optimal functioning is important. In the workforce, when you take a 5-minute break every hour, you're actually more productive in those 55 minutes than if you just kept working. If you sleep 6 hours, you get less done during the day than if you slept 8, because your productivity and the quality of your work go down. So it's recognizing that rest is an integral part of peak performance. And if you're able to integrate that in properly and have a team that recognizes that, you'll be able to prolong your career and be a little bit resilient to burnout appearing in the first place. Because once it sets in, it's like having a bad weed problem in your yard. It's like once they establish themselves, they don't want to go anywhere.
Mhm. Yeah, right. Yeah, I love that analogy. That's true. I mean, it's same could be said for negative thoughts, right? Like once you get one, then they just all kind of come crawling through all over the place. So I love
Yeah,
that
yeah,
analogy.
they multiply fast and they dig
Mhm.
their roots deep.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, and it sounds like too, just with burnout, that the this necessary skills to kind of overcome it and work through it. These are wonderful life skills to be had, right? And things that athletes can take and carry into whatever their next venture or area of focus is, because it's going to be the same way that you're going to prevent burnout from happening, outside of sports. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would argue that all of the same tools contribute to holistic health and wellness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you by engaging in these things, you can avoid quite a few detrimental events, burnout being one of them, but it'll also add to your quality of life. It's very hard. Athletes are in a very difficult position because it's one of the most profound power imbalances, an athlete and a coach. And this is particularly true the higher the level, because, well, I'll put it this way, the highest paid public servant in most states, including politicians, uh, deans of schools, the highest paid public servant are coaches. And they're often treated as gods. And what power does one athlete have in bad circumstance to deal with just the tidal wave of authority and power that a coach has? Um, they feel very helpless and powerless in those circumstances. It's why abuse can become so rampant. And you can look at some terrible situations and wonder, how can this have happened for so long to so many people? The answer is power imbalance. The athletes feel they have no ability to escape the situation without completely destroying their opportunity for a career. And so, not sure what led me down this rabbit hole. What was the original question? I'm so sorry, Cone.
I think it was just talking about the transferability of skills, in terms of overcoming burnout as an athlete and then into post athletic life.
Oh boy, I really followed a red herring all over the place, didn't I? I would say that it in some ways, this aspect, if I can maybe just thinly tie it back to what your question is you really have to be mindful of who you surround yourself with. Um, Relationships with friends, romantic partners, bosses, colleagues. You really have to be mindful of the people who have control over your daily life, or who you've brought in really closely. Not all of us have that ability to make those choices fully. You can't choose your family. Sometimes you're in a job and you just really do have to deal with it for a bit. Um, Always recognizing the fact that abuse is never something to tolerate.
Right.
And that really requires a person to create boundaries. How far in do you let that person go if they're a family member? To what extent are you able to navigate a relationship with a boss if you're not able to leave that job right away? It speaks to being able to create boundaries and to stand up for oneself in a manner that is appropriate to the situation. And so for athletes, good communication is really key. And you run into problems on both sides. You run into issues with athletes who feel like they know better how to coach the team than the coach does. That is not appropriate communication. But athletes also really need to learn how to speak for themselves with coaching in order to have a back and forth where both of them might be able to better work together. Good coaches welcome those conversations, even if they feel like the athlete is maybe not thinking clearly about the big picture, because the athlete doesn't get that big picture. But those are important conversations then, because we're all able to learn.
Right. Right. I think it's so important what you said about boundaries, because I just think about in the professional world, post sports, boundaries. It's like, I'm not going to work all night, right? in terms of what you were saying, talking about communicating with a boss, like, no, I'm my cutoff is, whatever, 6 p.m., 5 p.m., whatever that is, right? Even if there's pressure on the outside, that's trying to get me to shift my boundary there, right? Or, I can't, I'm not going to take a lunch break today, right? Like there will constantly be things that test your boundaries. And it seems to me that having a stronger sense of not only what you need, but what's good for you can help you, avoid burnout in, beyond sport as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that it's good to go the extra mile, but don't keep running marathons. You want to present yourself as a team player, and it's good to be flexible and adaptable, but you can't be taken advantage of or fail to be rewarded. And knowing where those lines are, I think, is both a personal experience. Where are my red lines in the sand? But I think it also requires talking to wise mentors, having people who've been there, whose advice you trust, and being able to get that communication and mentorship of, well, what should I expect from this? Because we can't know what we don't know. And everything feels normal if you've never been through it before. So it is really important to find and surround yourself with people whose opinions you trust, who can help instruct you on wise ways of thinking about things.
I want to open it up because I've been asking, all the questions, and I see, Katie, you had a nice comment. Do you or Catherine have any questions for Dan on this topic or comments?
Yeah, sorry, I've been off camera because I was eating lunch. But I was listening in. No, yeah, I guess you covered so much of it. I was like kind of going through questions and then you were going over it, kind of like how to identify burnout because we work with some current athletes and athletes who are also transitioning and so or like about to transition who might be feeling that burnout. And it was really interesting hearing about what you said in terms of like how that burnout can affect their transition. And also how you kind of related it back to, you related some things to kind of love and relationships and the importance of other relationships and things going on in your life. And so it kind of just gives me some, as a coach, some great like kind of flags to look for and to kind of provide some support before the burnout happens, which I think is really, really valuable. So I appreciate that. And what I was really resonating with was when you said you went down this rabbit hole, about kind of the power dynamic between coaches and players and how that power dynamic can translate to the rest of like to the transition and how maybe an athlete shows up in their career or in other relationships. And I have found that like just really powerfully in my own life, but also what I've kind of witnessed, especially with female athletes who had a lot of male coaches, is how that dynamic has kind of molded us to accept abusive behavior from especially men, male bosses, male partners, and how normalized it feels and then shows up beyond. And so it's just that I've have a lot of thoughts and feelings about that, but it was really nice hearing somebody else talk about that and some of the issues around it because I feel like it's really not talked about a lot and especially with the male female dynamic too, just from my own experience playing team sports
Yeah,
in
I'm
that way.
very glad you brought that up. And it's a tough issue to talk about as a male. I certainly don't want to sound like I'm mansplaining anything, but one of the risk factors is gender, and women are more prone to burnout than men. Some of that has to do with um, women feeling less empowered to assert themselves. Some of it has to do with the fact that women are generally a little bit more attuned to, sensitive, and aware of the expectations of others, and are a little bit less callous about letting other people down or feeling like they can be selfish about taking care of themselves and putting self first. Um, and that they get pressure. They just get more pressure in a social environment to show up for people than I think men do. And so those pressures also affect men, but I think women are much more inclined to really have that, both in their environment and also within their own self pressure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Always see a comment from Catherine. I'll read it in case she can't come on to speaker, but she said, piggybacking on Katie's comments, what responsibility does the institution or organization have to the athlete to keep them safe?
Oh God, I mean, they have 100% responsibility. Does that actually happen? Sadly, not always or everywhere. Um, the problem with sport is that it is big business, and the pressure to win, or at a minimum, the pressure to do better than you did last time, is profound, and people's lives are at stake. I mean, it's thankfully rare that someone gets killed for a sporting mistake, although that does happen. And certainly people get threatened a lot. Um, but it's not unusual for a coach to get fired if their team fails to meet whatever expectations management has. And fans are brutal and ruthless. And so a lot of it falls on a coach. I sympathize with coaches for the position that they're in. In many ways, they remind me of teachers. They are trapped between parents, students, administrators. They're like the thing that gets yanked in every direction. And so it's a very difficult and sometimes contradictory place to be, because coaches are supposed to love their athletes, for who they are as people, and at the same time be able to just dismiss them from the team in a moment's notice. Um, that's a very sad statement to make. You're supposed to feel like you're a part of something, that there's like a larger body that the team are all integral parts of. And yet, for how long does that last? And under what conditions? So, it's a very strange circumstance. The coaches who end up turning to punitive, derogatory techniques, who make athletes fearful of mistakes, who pit athletes against each other, who drive home a fear message of, if you don't perform, you're out of here. Their athletes are going to be less happy, obviously. They're not going to perform as well. Fear of risk means no one is taking shots. And their athletes are going to be more prone to burnout. But it's an easy place to go when you're afraid for your own job. And so coaches really need to be trained on methodologies that support athlete wellness, that they're a part of something bigger than themselves, that even though they may get let go from the team, they're valued as people, and that whatever their role is, they're contributing to something important, and their presence is valued. And so that kind of leadership style, valuing the athlete above their productivity, and even though their productivity is important, it's tricky, but makes a huge difference. And I think that there are ways to do it. And it's, again, sort of back to what it is when it's happening. You can sometimes walk into a practice and instantly know, is this a fun, good environment healthy environment for athletes to be in? Or is everybody here miserable and hating it? You can kind of walk into a store and get that same experience.
Mhm.
And there's a trickle down from that. It starts at the top and it filters down through the coaches and the trainers, the assistants. It filters down all the way to the players.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it would be so wonderful to see, coaches and people in leadership and in sports and athletics prioritize this, right? Because ultimately the goal is to have the athletes at their best, right? And the teams performing at their best. And it's just there's so many parts of someone being at their best, right? That don't just involve the actual sport and winning and all of that. And so my hope is that we'll get to a place where, we start looking at things and athletes more holistically versus just on, just at the wins, right? And what we do to get them to win. So thank you.
Yeah, and to be fair to everybody, one of the hardest things for really excellent coaches to deal with is players who feel like they deserve more minutes. Uh,
Mhm.
when the coach looks at the whole picture and realizes, my best athletes are on the field. And how do you help an athlete appreciate the role that they have when they feel like they're not getting what they are there for, or what they want, or what they feel they deserve? It's a very tricky thing because at the end of the day, at the highest level, it is about winning.
Yeah.
It is a business. Um, and this isn't first grade soccer where everybody gets to play and we don't keep score. So it's a very tricky setting, the
Mhm.
sport environment.
Yeah. Yeah. But thank you for bringing that up, right? Like that perspective, like Katie and Catherine said, just in terms of just the dynamics, the power, the influences that are so important. And I think how our identities as athletes and our experiences impact our relationships beyond sports is so powerful. And it sounds like, there's some elements of burnout that are tied into that. And so again, the skills that we use to prevent and overcome burnout can help us, flourish in those other areas of our life once again. So
Yeah, what's the best way to grow a beautiful garden is have great soil.
mhm.
I mean, the environment that we are growing in is key, and you want to set yourself up for success. And the best way to do that is the KISS technique. Keep it simple, stupid. I mean, get your rest, get good, healthy physical activity, eat properly, surround yourself with good people, and know the things that you involve yourself in that build you up. Don't just be one dimensional. Really have balance in terms of the way that you express your time and your life and your values. And then you really harden yourself. You have a great shield against the inevitable hardships that come from every aspect of our life. Even the best romances have periods of trouble. And so how do you weather that? You have to learn how to be resilient.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dan, if our viewers or people who are listening to this, want to learn more about kind of your research and how you support athletes, where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have two suggestions. One of them is join Athlete Soul if they haven't already. We're working on some opportunities for athletes that I'm hoping we can have available within the next few months. I always welcome people to reach out directly to me. You can just Google my name with sports psychology and just send me an email if you have a question. I have no problem responding to people if they come to me directly. And I'll add that I'm not the only one who knows this or knows how to do this. Um, Former athletes, other professionals in the field, other mental health providers, even wise coaches and trainers and medical doctors, the people who've been there, go to the people who you trust to give you wise counsel, and don't be afraid to consult with somebody. I like to say that, going to talk to someone like myself isn't just about feeling broken and not wanting to be broken anymore. If you just want your life to be better and to move towards thriving, we do that too.
Good. Don't wait. You're saying don't wait until you're at rock bottom to reach
Right.
out.
Yeah, that's a
Good
long
advice.
way. Yeah. I mean, it gets harder and harder, right? The further you allow an injury to progress, generally the longer it takes to recover. And in some ways, the further you get from ever getting back to 100%. So, don't let the damage get too far. That's where the self-awareness comes in. Be able to really look at yourself honestly, and don't feel like the only solution is gutting it out. It's not a bad solution. Sometimes you have to go the extra mile, but you don't have to be running marathons. If you feel like you are constantly paddling as hard as you can and yet unable to keep yourself from feeling like you're drowning, that's a problem.
Yeah, that's a good description. If anyone watching is Googling if they're burned out, you probably are.
True. Good point. Good
Yeah, the
point.
fatigue, I mean, that is the single most identifying characteristic, is you just feel tired, you just don't want to do. And we all have afternoons like that. But, if you find the days are just threading together, where it's just hard to get out of bed, and then you just feel like you could go to sleep at the snap of a finger, things that you used to feel exuberant about, you're just indifferent to. Those are all bad signs that the way that you're currently operating is not supporting a quality of life. And it's time to really think differently about it and maybe do differently about it. Because sometimes thinking differently about something is all you need. For the athletes who feel like they're not getting the minutes that they want or the opportunities that they want, but their coach has talked to them and given them honest feedback and had those caring conversations about their value. The athlete just may have to come to think differently if they're going to stay on the team about their role. They just may have to approach it differently. For every starter, there's a Rudy. And Rudy had probably the single greatest, and maybe I'm dating myself by bringing up this movie, but he had the single greatest attitude of a role athlete on a team. What can I do to bring up all of the athletes around me so that the best product is put on the field? And even though I'm not in a jersey, I'm a part of that.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's what you need to do. Sometimes that's your role.
Yeah, and it sounds like just like having the expectations, being given those expectations from the coaches, and then buying into that, whether you agree and you can do that role or not, and maybe it's not a good fit to be on that team. Maybe.
Might not be. Good coaches are able to make a very clear, data-driven, if possible, argument for where the person's role is and make a statement about what kind of growth might allow them to be reconsidered. These days, a lot of athletes just jump right into the portal, and maybe they'll have opportunities elsewhere. I certainly don't. I don't feel like for all athletes that is a bad move. But it creates a lot of instability, both for the athlete and for the programs. And, it's hard to know what the right thing is.
Yes.
Well, I know that I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, and for the platform that Athlete Soul offers to athletes and for professionals like myself. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this important subject.
Yes. Thank you so much for your contributions and for your wisdom. And thank you for everyone for participating, and we will see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye.
Thanks, Dan.
You're very welcome.